This video is for teachers conducting a lesson where the students practice historical empathy. And even though the examples mentioned in this video are from day 14 of Unit 3, the skills, approaches, and tools discussed can easily be applied to lessons pertaining to other content. The focus of this lesson, which is here on slide 6, is for students to consider how perspectives on immigration have changed in the United States. And they're really going to be comparing old and new immigration with that of today. This lesson starts with two visuals, a map and a cartoon, that will engage the students and introduce concepts to them that are going to be relevant as they progress through the lesson. The students will then read two secondary texts. The first one you see right here, Old and New Immigrants, and the second is How Has Immigration Changed in the Last 100 Years? And both of these texts are really going to provide them with the context that they're going to use in steps 1 and 2 of the historical empathy tool. Now, the slide that's between them on slide 13, this is going to allow them to organize their thoughts. And before moving forward in the lesson, after they read the two secondary sources, I would ask students to demonstrate their understanding of this content by asking them like a low stakes question that would be a quick indicator of their comprehension, such as asking them to share in the chat or an online discussion board if it's available, like one historical detail that stood out to them from either of these readings. So once the background reading is done, we're going to get to the actual start of the historical empathy activity, which we're going to find on slide 19, right here. And it starts off by giving the students the given definition of what historical empathy is. And then they're going to internalize it. And down below in this box, they're going to kind of create a definition of their own. Now, depending how often our students have done this already, there are different modifications that can be made. For instance, if this was the first time my own students were being introduced to historical empathy, I might have them participate in a structured small group discussion, like a think, pair, share activity, using the breakout rooms in Zoom, if that's available. And that's where they can gain some nuance about the concept by gaining exposure to the thoughts and perceptions of their peers. And really, for my students, making sure they have a good grasp on what it is going to pay dividends as we move forward. Again, anticipating the needs of my own students, I would find ways to stress two things to them before moving forward. First, empathy does not mean sympathy. And second, empathy does not mean agreement. And to demonstrate these to the class, I would use one of the stronger student-generated definitions, and I would share it with the class, and then we'd apply it to a relevant example that my students are aware of. And this could be anything from like a controversial political event to a social movement, or even to some event that happened in the sports or entertainment world. And I would ask the class what it would look like for us to empathize with the individuals or groups involved. The students then move on to reading The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus and annotating for the look-fors listed here on slide 20. And doing so is going to provide them with a solid foundation for which they can refer back to when they are building that historical empathy later on. Now, I know my own students would struggle with this part, especially because the ideas in these look-fors, like the considering, connecting, recognizing, and especially understanding, these are pretty abstract and in a lot of ways subjective. So therefore, before actually getting into the reading of the poem, I would take time to look at each of these thoroughly with them and provide extended definitions or even examples of what they should be looking for. And in some cases, if time permits, I would even consider doing a model or a think aloud as I go through this the first time with them. So if this was the first time my students did this activity, I would also strongly consider showing them a model of the poem that I had annotated ahead of time. And for the purposes of this video, I do have one right here. And since the coding I did is subjective and the decisions I made came down to like my rationale, theirs probably won't look exactly the same as this. So I could not simply give this to them and say, hey, check your answers against mine. But knowing the needs of my students, I would consider doing a walkthrough of why I annotated it the way I did, making certain to make clear connections between my rationales here with the explanations that they see here on the slide. And if possible, I would ask for student volunteers to see if they could then justify why I annotated it certain ways that I did so they can kind of see my thinking. And if time permits, I would also ask for student volunteers to share their own annotations that they made with the class. And again, the better the understanding they have at this point, the better that their work is going to be as they go through the actual historical empathy process. After having read and annotated the new Colossus based on this color scheme, I would remind the students that all of these texts that they read, the two secondary sources at the beginning of class, the poem by Emma Lazarus right here, all of these can be used and should be used to help construct the contextualization, which is step one of this process. And for my students that may be struggling with this part, I would remind them that while the secondary sources may appear more factual, they should really also consider the imagery about US immigration that Emma Lazarus embedded into her poem and also really draw from that. Now that they have their own context, and in step two, which we can see right here, this is where they're going to find similarities and differences and really connect the historical context to the present. I would stop and survey the students and ask them which historical individuals and or groups they think would be appropriate perspectives to consider when doing steps 3 and 4. If needed, I would also consider making a class list visible to all. And doing so would not only ensure students remain on the right path, but also provide options to students who may struggle to come up with their own. When we get to step 3, taking a moment to ensure students are comfortable with what the word perspective means is also really important because it is in the check for understanding at the end of this lesson, but it also appears all over the regions in both the multiple choice and the SEQs. And looking at this step as a whole, I would stress to the students that this one is really all about identifying how the person or group perceived, experienced, and reacted to the events in the historical context that they had created. And finally, at this point, the students should know enough about the historical context, how it relates to the present day, and the perspectives of their chosen individuals or groups to be able to properly empathize with them. And before tackling these 3 prompts that are going to guide them through this process, students may benefit from revisiting the definition of historical empathy that they created at the beginning of this lesson. Upon completion, the students move to the wrap-up activity, which asks them to use their insight into United States immigration and how it's changed over the years, and determine if the poem, The New Colossus, is describing new, old, or today's immigration. This is such a good question to ask because it really does tie together some of the major components of this lesson. And I know my own students would likely have a pretty equal distribution of answers between the 3 options. And I know it's hard doing this remotely, but if using a platform that enables it, like Zoom, I would create a poll where the class would be able to see how their peers responded. And then the teacher can even ask some to share their decisions and even provide their justifications.